Okay, we're supposed to have about 30 minutes for this discussion and then about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. I'm going to start it off, but if anyone has a question at any point, just please stand up, wave your hands, even as we're talking, and I'll throw you into the discussion, okay? I'll reintroduce some of the members of the panel. Of course, you know the Secretary of Tourism, Ramon Jimenez. Aileen Clemente, beside him, is the head of Raja Tours and also from the Philippine Travel Agencies Association. Dr. Rolando Dy is representing the agribusiness sector. He's with the University of Asia and the Pacific. Bobby Batungbacal is with Dow Chemical, Dow Chemical, right? Yes. And also the Chemical Industries Association of the Philippines. He's representing the manufacturing sector for us here today. And John Ridsdel is with TVI, which operates a mine in Zamboanga del Norte. What I'll do is, according to the organizers, I'll go around, ask everyone one or two questions. So I'll ask the same question of everyone. Could you point out in your sector what's been the biggest accomplishment or the biggest challenge in the last 1 or 2 years? Maybe we begin with the mining sector and John.
I wasn't expecting that. The mining sector is the one that I think Secretary Ocampo indicated was last year had a growth rate of -7%. So, and reflecting on John Forbes' review of the Arangkada scorecard and track record, mining is one of the ones that is not advancing to the same degree. So as Roger Dimmel said, the challenge is how do we make mining, and in fact I prefer to use the term minerals development, go forward. If you'll permit me, I'd like to quote from a recent speech by Secretary of Finance Parissima when he, as I've put it here, said it all. In a speech to kick off the country's application to join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Secretary Parissima said, and I quote, "If we were able to resolve the issues we're dealing with in mining, this industry can actually provide an extra gear or two to the Philippine economy. In fact," said Secretary Parissima, "I believe that mining can easily provide 1 or 2 percentage points growth of GDP if we were able to do it properly." End of quote. In short, ladies and gentlemen, mining can be a major contributor to the economy and GDP and social development and revenues, and recognizing the Philippines for investment grade. So looking back on 2012 and in response to your question, I think industry would say that the good news, the number one accomplishment, was that the administration decided what the issues are. Secretary Parissima said if we can resolve the issues. It took some time, but in fact they have identified what those issues are. And it passed Executive Order EO 79 as a framework for going forward to resolve the issues. In other words, the administration has, if you'll pardon the expression, passed through the valley of doubt and has emerged on the other side on the plateau of commitment. There were clearly a number of very good elements in EO 79 as accomplishments. The executive order recognizes existing contracts. It established a cabinet-level committee for moving forward. It commits to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that I mentioned. It promises to do something about the scourge of illegal mining, and it asserts the primacy of national law over LGU ordinances. The bad news was that we've taken a long time to get to this point. And meanwhile, the moratorium on mining continues and industry is on hold or even going backwards. -7-point-something% was what was the number that Secretary Ocampo had in his remarks. And I would say that except for companies with existing contracts, which are recognized, industry is staying away in droves. There are no new agreements. Companies are not exploring. And we have to remember that in the extractive industries, it takes a long time to wind things back up. So while we decided what the main issues are to resolve, the problem is that we actually didn't resolve any of them. And the biggest issue to resolve, again, starting to look forward, the biggest issue to resolve is the fiscal regime or the government share, where government thinks it's not getting enough, and now because it's a financial issue, we have to wait until there's a new Congress, and so industry will be going backwards, and in a moratorium even further. For the record, the public sector share, as we refer to it, not just the finance department's tax receipts, but the public sector share is actually much bigger than the government appears to think. That's because not only does industry pay excise tax and income tax, which the Department of Finance sees, but it also pays something like 20 other taxes to various governments, departments and agencies and LGUs, and a 1 to 2% gross royalty to indigenous people, and 1.5% of operating costs to the social development and management plans for schools, hospital, sustainable development. And we have to build roads and bridges and provide electricity and security for the surrounding regions so government does not have to. And even though mining is a relatively capital-intensive rather than labor-intensive industry, we contributed a very significant multiplier for economic activity and employment both locally and nationally. And finally, industry is increasingly conscious of the importance of targeting long-term social and environmental sustainability.
John, would you let me interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I'm going to go around the panel.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Bobby now, who represents the manufacturing sector, what's either the biggest accomplishment or the biggest challenge facing the industry?
Good. Thank you, Coco. I'd like to mention three. I'll try to squeeze it in a few minutes. First one, I think, would be awareness. No, I think our awareness on the important or the strategic importance of manufacturing has been pretty recent. If you think about the first time Arangkada was written, of course it was there, of course it was recognized to be an important industry, but policymakers, private sector didn't have a high priority for it. We came from one end of the spectrum where people were asking, meron pa bang manufacturing? To the middle of the spectrum today where people are saying, we didn't realize that manufacturing was such a big part of the economy. So I think this is a very important accomplishment for this year because it raises the prioritization that both the private sector and the public sector will put on this important sector. No? Now, just to point it out, in the last 12 months, it became a hot topic and an interesting topic. The Federation of Philippine Industry had their second manufacturing conference. You have labor groups, you have investor groups, everybody coming up with their manufacturing forum with the intention of reviving and growing the manufacturing sector. That's the first one. I think the second most important accomplishment this year was the creation of the roadmaps. And Secretary Domingo and other speakers talked a lot about that. But I think what's important to point out in the creation of the roadmap is that it's been quite inclusive. That before we would make roadmaps for the biggest guys, the SAPs, the BPOPs. Now it's pretty comprehensive. You'd even see roadmaps for laminated bamboo materials, that kind of thing. So it includes so many industry associations. But the important thing is that the BOI is working with PIDS on this one, and they are putting it together into a manufacturing roadmap for the Philippines. I think that's very important because it enables the government to see, to coordinate all of this effort and enable industry associations to work with each other. That's where you get synergy. I do have a lot more, but you might want to go to the next one.
Okay, Rolando Dy represents the agribusiness sector.
Many people do not realize that the direct effect of agribusiness is about close to 40% of employment. And if you add the multiplier effect, and I'm saying the part of the output of agriculture is processed by manufacturing, and we buy for manufacturing, we're talking about easily 60% of the employment is affected by agriculture. The major long-term problems are really low productivity, lack of diversification, inefficient value chain. However, there are three important observations I have in 2012, which is very important, I think, for the future. It takes time to change policy in this country. You have the executive branch and you have also the legislative branch. One is there is now refocusing on food security trust from just rice self-sufficiency to food staples sufficiency. White corn, cassava, coconut, kamote, they have large multipliers, more distributive, more inclusive, and they're less water intensive. You know, water will be a crisis in the 21st century. Second, given that there's greater emphasis on other crops to address rural development. Major problem is not only we have lack of private investments, but there is surplus capacity in some sectors of the economy. Coconut oil milling, rubber processing, because of very low raw material base, because of lack of investments precisely in the non-rice sector. And a third, there's now a better understanding on the part of government for convergence and value chain coordination. DA, DAR, DTI, DNR, etc. And this has been exemplified by more private sector participation, for example, in the rubber roadmap, UAPD, the benchmarking of the rubber industry and coffee industry in Southeast Asia. I'll get back to later, because I have to give time also my colleagues here on the most important thing to spur private investments in the country.
And Aileen Clemente represents the Tourism Association. You can either say what are the big issues right now, or even better yet, you can just ask Secretary Jimenez a question. I think we'd all prefer that. No, you ask him a question.
Okay. Well, first, I wouldn't want to ask more questions to the Secretary, because the Department of Tourism under his leadership has been very, very cooperative and has been usually been in consultation with the private sector, and kudos to that. And the reason why tourism is ahead right now is because the private sector has worked on it years back to institutionalize via the 2009 Tourism Act certain aspects that would propel it to grow. And of course, the tourism industry is made of mostly women, feisty women at that. So it was made into law, and part of that is the National Tourism Development Plan. And that is what is moving us forward. And just to touch a bit on the question, in the Philippine Development Plan, there's the 5 major guideposts, and one I would focus on, which is rapid, inclusive, and sustained economic growth. And part of the act is really including other government agencies to already be a part of the planning process. And I think moving forward, it's really institutionalizing the new mindset that is present for tourism growth. And the policies that are required for further growth. As the Secretary has mentioned, we have an archipelagic landscape, and it is a must push for our aviation to be treated as a conduit to trade and to provide economies of scale. And that is a big, big thing that we need to really do. It has passed through both houses of Congress, and it's meant to be signed into law. And we hope that happens very soon. And the other one is the incentives. We are growing, but we need to grow faster, because the pipe can burst at any time, because the supply is not present, because we need more investments at the onset. And the last is just mindset, active consciousness of what we need to have, and that there's a trickle down on the high-level discussion so that there's no barriers to entry.
I have a question for Secretary Jimenez. You were talking about how the target is 10 million arrivals by 2016. Last year, I think we had about 4 million. You're saying 5.5 this year. Our main airports were at capacity already last year. Were you going to squeeze the 1.5 million additional arrivals this year into those airports, since we don't have any new airports yet so far?
Well, again, this is precisely the paradigm shift that is taking place all over the system. When today, of course, we bandy around words like convergence as if we were doing it before. The fact of the matter is we are only doing it in earnest now. When I talk about convergence with the DPWH, in the same breath, will have to talk about convergence between us at the DOT and the DOTC, or even entities like the POEA. Let me give you an example. It is only in a convergence meeting that people finally realized that about 95% of all OFW workers pass through Manila. That accounts for about 35% of the traffic going through NAIAs 1, 2, and 3. Why? Somebody said, well, actually, we don't know why, but we process all our workers through Manila. Even if I'm from Cebu, I cannot fly home directly to Cebu because my papers are processed in Manila. In the next 2 years, the convergence team will look at dispersing OFW arrivals through our airports. That's where you're going to get some space. And this is just an example of the shift in paradigms that actually happen when people sit across a table and start comparing notes. It is a more transparent approach. It is a more insightful approach to our problems.
You mentioned that we're going to have 11 international airports by 2016. Is it 11 additional, or we're going to have a total of
11 airports capable of receiving international flights, yes.
Right.
For example, very few people know that Iloilo's runway will actually take an Airbus 330. That it's ready now, but we need the air agreements to bring them in. That's why, like I said, a lot of these things are, when you talk about releasing demand, you actually have to create the connectivity and the agreements that will actually do that. But we have more facilities than people actually thought.
Okay, if there are any questions from the audience, please do just stand up. But before, okay, there's a question here already. I think that's Mr. Ordonez.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. I am the head of cement manufacturers, which increased 17%, best in 15 years. But also the head of Allianz Agricultura, which lost jobs in the poultry sector. 20% of our smallholders lost their jobs. So we see here growth, but not inclusive growth. So my question is this. Incidentally, my most important job for today's session is that I'm recently appointed chair of the Anti-Smuggling Committee of the National Competitiveness Council, concentrating on agriculture, but which will hit industry. My question, which deserves only a yes or no, with a small explanation, is addressed to both industry and agriculture, which are dying from smuggling. Here's the question. I have calculated smuggling every single year for the last 12 years, and I found out smuggling is worse now the last 2 years as compared before. So on page 116 of Arangkada, you say it has started, but it is worse now. And that's why I think that today will be a milestone. I have computed for every year that whenever, repeat, whenever customs is left alone, smuggling skyrockets. But when smuggling is looked upon, BOC is looked upon with a committee, interagency with some private sector, smuggling goes down. Question to Mr. Batungbacal for industry and Mr. Rolando Dy for agriculture. Do you or do you not favor the resurrection of a committee that is proven to work, which will look at the customs activities, because right now only finance looks at it and they hardly look at it. So, Mr. Batungbacal and Mr. Rolando Dy, do you agree that we should have like an oversight little group spurred by Arangkada that will look at customs in a systematic way and recommend, the beauty being that there is monitoring of customs where today there is no real monitoring of customs? Thank you.
Would that help?
Well, if you look at our assessment in the Arangkada workbook, smuggling is actually the only one where we did worse compared to all other metrics. So I can't agree more with our friend Dr. Ordonez there that it needs coordinated effort beyond the DOF. And coordinated effort certainly includes private sector as well. Professor Dy?
The magnitude of smuggling, the data is accessible to the public, sorry. In fact, we did research for 2011, 500,000 tons of palm oil left Malaysia, this is palmolene, and only 27,000 tons reached the Philippines for that classification. 350,000 tons came back, arrived in the Philippines in a different VAT-free classification. The same year, 84,000 tons of onion and garlic left China, less than 25,000 tons arrived in the Philippines. This is, you asked me where, and you can say that as well for meat products. So definitely, I would agree with Ka Ernie here of Alyansang Agrikultura that there has to be some serious oversight on the trade, the informal trade of agricultural products.
I mean, for a layman like me, the reason why smuggling, quote unquote, works is because their goods are cheaper than ours, are cheaper to produce there than our own goods here. If you were to turn that around, in 2016, we're supposed to have an ASEAN free trade area. And some people have told me that the agriculture sector cannot compete with the goods that are going to come in with very low duties or no duties in 2016. Will the agriculture sector suffer a lot? Or how bad will it suffer in 2016? How prepared is it for that, for the AFTA, for the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement?
2015.
15, sir.
That's a good question. Actually, any country cannot specialize in everything. We trade on the basis of competitive advantage. We did a benchmarking study of sugar industry between Thailand and the Philippines, and Secretary Purisima is aware of this. In terms of cost competitiveness, we are down 35%, 15% farm yield and around 15% mill efficiency. So, but you cannot operate on the basis of averages. The modern farmers in Negros and Bukidnon can survive this and can be competitive. I think the main problem is that unlike in Australia and New Zealand, good farmers can buy land or lease land to expand. That is difficulty here. And I just came back from Mindanao. I've been to your area, northern Mindanao and southern Mindanao. We have comparative advantage in tree crops, but we have not invested in tree crops. Coconut, oil palm, coffee, cocoa, etc. We import 80%, almost 80% of our coffee. We import 80% of our palm oil. There is a market out there hungry for more rubber or coconut, but we have not invested. So this is something that the private sector is looking for to have a major trust on developing tree crops in this country, as experienced by many Southeast Asian countries. So I think the key here is looking at the value chain competitiveness of these products. And of course, this is not a walk in the park because it's been a long time that we have neglected this. The political sector talks about rice self-sufficiency, which is perhaps not an easy thing to do. They talk about exporting rice, which is going to be big losses. I'm happy that the Secretary is talking about exporting fancy rice varieties, which is we are more competitive. There are opportunities for us to expand markets. There are opportunities where we have to buy some of this market. But if we just address logistics, value chain, and investing in R&D, I think we can compete just like any other Southeast Asian countries using modern science in addressing agricultural productivity.
You know, our time is up, so let me just ask John one question before we go. How can the mining industry prosper in the next couple of years if the Congress doesn't fix the taxes, which is the condition for new mining permits?
Can it or how can it?
Either way.
It can't. In effect, listen, I mean, I think everybody is very sympathetic with the government that, you know, as Secretary Purisima said, it's a finite resource, it's a depleting resource. We need to be clear on what the costs are and what the benefits are. The problem is that we've frozen the industry that while we're thinking about these imponderables, there's a moratorium on new permits. So basically all that's happening is, in the industry, is those companies that already have existing mines and existing projects and existing exploration permits are working forward. Nobody else is. And government has been quite steadfast in saying that until we revise the fiscal terms, nobody's going to go forward. And you know, that's clearly a policy decision that they've made. Industry is working very hard to work with government. The International Monetary Fund has made an analysis and proposals. The key is to get the lead out, basically, and the moment Congress gets back in after the election to get the fiscal regime revised so that industry can start to gear up again.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm being told that our discussion has to wrap up, but I guess that means that lunch is going to be sooner for everyone. So please help me in thanking this morning's panel.